The air over eastern Dakota Territory tasted of iron and dry snow. 3 days of wind had scoured the prairie flat, and now the silence that followed pressed against the ground like a hand holding something down. The lake was a white field rimmed with black willow stems. Nothing moved except the frost, which crept. Near the shore, a woman in a coat too thin for the cold was on her knees beside a chopped hole in the ice, hauling a rope hand over hand. Water streamed from whatever she was pulling up, freezing on contact with the air. On the table inside her cabin, a split potato lay beside a child's wooden spoon, frozen gray-white clear through. Martin Van Gen died on the 23rd of October, 1880, 2 miles from the cabin he had not finished building. The hay wagon tipped on a frozen rut. The ox team dragged it 40 feet before the axle caught a stump and stopped. By then, Martin was under the load. A neighbor found him at dusk, already cold, his right hand still gripping the brake lever. Tilda Vangen buried her husband on a Tuesday. By Thursday, she understood what his death actually meant. She was 29 years old, Norwegian-born, raised in Minnesota mill country before Martin brought her west on a promise of open land and a finished house by winter. The house was half finished. The cellar beneath it was worse, 6 feet deep where it needed 8, cribbed with loose boards instead of stone, because Martin had run out of timber and time in the same week. He had planned to finish it in November. November no longer belonged to him. Tilda had 3 children. Eli was 9 and old enough to carry water. Ragnar was 6 and old enough to be frightened. Nels was 3 and had started coughing the week his father died, a wet sound that came from somewhere deeper than a child's chest should allow. She had food. That was the single fact that separated her from immediate disaster. 21 bushels of potatoes filled the cellar bins. 8 bushels of carrots sat in sand beside them. 2 barrels of apples. 1 small barrel of salted pork. 6 sacks of flour, dried beans, onions, and 32 jars of preserved plums and chokecherries lined the back wall on a shelf Martin had nailed up in September. If nothing went wrong, the food would last 6 months. If she stretched it, 7. But Tilda could not leave. The claim was mortgaged. Martin's ox team had been sold to pay the lumber debt before he died, and the money still fell short. The rail line into De Smet had become unreliable as the weather turned. Trains delayed, then canceled, then simply absent for weeks. She had no cash for passage east. Her brother in Minnesota had written once since Martin's death, a letter that arrived with sympathy and without money. She was 2 miles from town, 300 yards from a deep glacial lake, and alone with 3 children in a cabin that did not have a proper door on its east wall. Martin had hung a horse blanket there. The wind came from the east. The first blizzard arrived on the 15th of November, and it taught Tilda what the word winter actually meant in Dakota Territory. She had known cold in Minnesota. She had known snow that buried fence posts and wind that made the barn groan. But Minnesota had neighbors within shouting distance, a father who understood wood and water, and a house with 4 finished walls. Dakota had distance. Dakota had flatness that let the wind build speed for 100 miles before it hit her blanket door. Dakota had a kind of cold that did not simply arrive, it invaded. It pressed through every crack and gap and seam in the cabin walls, turned breath to ice on wool blankets, and made the children sleep in a pile near the stove like animals denning. The cellar held through November. The potatoes stayed firm. The jars did not crack. The carrots kept their color in the sand. Tilda checked every morning, descending the rough ladder with a lantern, pressing her palm against the earthen walls to feel for frost. The walls were cool, but not frozen. The food was safe. She told herself this every morning. The food was safe. Then Bernd Halvorsen came. Bernd Halvorsen was 62 years old and had wintered on the Great Plains longer than any Norwegian within 40 miles. He had been a military provisioner in the old country before emigrating, a man who understood supply lines the way most men understood plowing, as a matter of survival, not theory. He walked with a slight forward lean as though permanently bracing against wind, and he spoke with the particular authority of someone who had watched other people's plans fail for decades. He arrived on a gray morning in early December, uninvited, carrying a hand lantern and a steel probe he used for testing frozen ground. He did not knock. He stood at the blanket door and called Tilda's name, and when she appeared, he said he had come to see the cellar. Tilda let him in because refusing Bernd Halverson was not something widows did in that community. He was respected. His opinion carried weight at the store, at the church, at every gathering where men decided who deserved help and who deserved pity. He descended the ladder without asking permission. His lantern threw orange light across the bins and barrels. He pressed his probe into the east wall, then the north wall, then the floor. He tapped the cribbing boards with his knuckle and listened to the sound they made. He picked up a potato and held it near the lantern, turning it, examining the skin for the faint translucence that precedes freezing. Then he climbed back up and stood in Tilda's kitchen, where Eli was feeding the stove and Ragnar was watching from behind a chair, and he delivered his verdict. "You have 6 feet of dirt where you need 8, Bernd said. "You have loose board cribbing where you need stone. You have enough food for April only if none of it freezes." Tilda said nothing. She had known the cellar was shallow. She had not known how to measure what that meant. Bernd continued. He told her that the frost line in a normal Dakota winter reached 4 feet. In a hard winter, it could reach 6 or deeper. Her cellar floor sat at 6 feet. If the frost drove past that, and this winter was already colder than the last 3, the temperature inside the cellar would drop below freezing. Not by much, not dramatically, but enough. "Potatoes freeze at 28 degrees, Bernd said. "They go sweet first, then black. You cannot eat them. Jars crack when the water inside expands. Carrots split. Apples turn to mush. Your salted pork will hold longer, but if the cold reaches the brine, it changes too." He looked at the bins. 21 bushels of potatoes, 8 bushels of carrots, 2 barrels of apples. "If you lose half," he said, "you are begging by February. If you lose more than half, you are selling the claim." Tilda asked what she could do. Bernd told her to bank earth against the cabin walls as high as she could manage, stuff straw into every crack in the cellar cribbing, and keep a candle burning below at all times for the small warmth it offered. Then he said the thing that stayed with her. "I have seen many cellars in many winters. Some hold, some do not. Yours is the shallowest I have inspected this year, and this is already the hardest freeze I have felt since '67. He left. He did not offer to help dig the cellar deeper. He did not offer food or fuel or labor. He had come to measure and to warn, and he had done both. Tilda stood in her kitchen after he left and pressed her palm against the cellar door. The wood was cold, not frozen, not yet, but cold in a way that felt like a promise. She banked the earth. She stuffed the straw. She lit the candle, and she waited. The temperature dropped through December like a stone falling through dark water. Each week was colder than the one before. Blizzards came in pairs, 3 days of screaming wind, then 2 days of stillness so cold the silence itself felt dangerous, then the wind again. The rail line into De Smet failed. Trains stopped coming. The town began to close inward, each household counting its own stores, its own fuel, its own chances. Tilda checked the cellar every morning. On the 12th of December, she found frost on the east wall, a thin white fur, delicate as spider silk, spreading across the packed earth. She scraped it with her fingernail and felt the hard crystal beneath. On the 15th, the frost reached the north wall. On the 18th, she descended the ladder and found the first jar cracked. A quart of preserved plums, the glass split cleanly from lip to base, the contents frozen into a purple-brown mass that smelled of sugar and cold stone. She carried it up and set it on the table. Eli looked at it and then looked at her. "How many jars do we have left?" he asked. 31, Tilda said. She did not say, for now. That night, the wind hit the horse blanket so hard it tore free from two of its nails. Tilda woke to snow blowing across the floor and Nell's coughing in the dark, a sound like tearing paper. She nailed the blanket back and stuffed rags around its edges and sat with Nell's against her chest until his breathing steadied. The candle in the cellar had blown out. She relit it and checked the bins. The potatoes on the east side of the bin had changed. They were not black yet, but when she pressed one with her thumb, the skin gave slightly, like pressing the cheek of a sleeping person. Too soft, too yielding. The frost was inside them now, working from the outside in. She was losing food. Not in a single dramatic collapse, but slowly, bin by bin, jar by jar, degree by degree. The cellar was failing exactly as Bernd Halverson had predicted, and there was nothing she could do to make 6 feet of earth behave like 8. Nothing she had been taught anyway. The idea came from water. On the morning of the 20th of December, the cabin pump froze. The handle would not move. Ice had formed in the pipe somewhere below the floor, and no amount of warming rags or heated stones would break it loose. Tilda needed water for the children, for cooking, for the single cow she still kept in the lean-to. She took the pail and walked to the lake. Lake Thompson lay 300 yards from the cabin, a deep glacial pool that stretched farther than Tilda could see in the low winter light. Its surface was locked under ice, white near the shore, gray-blue farther out, with pressure cracks running in crooked lines like veins on the back of a hand. The wind had scoured the snow thin in places, and the ice showed through, clouded and thick. Tilda took the hatchet and chopped a hole near the shore. The ice was 8 inches deep. Below it the water moved, black, slow, and liquid. Not frozen. She filled the pail and felt the water's weight. It was cold, but not ice cold. It had a heaviness to it, a density that surprised her hands. She stood there with the pail, and the memory arrived without warning. She was 7 years old, standing beside her father at a frozen mill race in Minnesota. Oddman Brecka, millwright, broad-handed and patient, had pushed a wooden pole through a hole in the ice and told her to grip it with him. She felt the current moving below the frozen surface, water flowing where it should have been solid. "Feel that," Oddman had said. His palm covered hers on the wet pole. His cuffs were dark with water, and the air smelled of sawdust and pond mud. The top freezes, the bottom does not. Water is strange near cold. The heaviest water sinks, and it is not the coldest water. He had lowered a tin cup through the hole, pulled up water that had not frozen, and pressed it against her cheek. She remembered the shock of it. Cold, yes, but not the killing cold of the air above. A different cold, a livable cold. Standing at Lake Thompson 22 years later, Tilda felt the same water against her hands. The cellar was failing because the ground froze. The ground froze because the air froze. But the lake, the deep water beneath the ice, had not frozen. It sat there, black and heavy and liquid, while the air above it tried to kill everything it touched. The realization came not as a flash, but as a question she could not stop asking. If the water below the ice stays above freezing, what else could it keep above freezing? She carried the pail back to the cabin. She set it on the table. She sat beside it while Nels coughed, and Ragna sorted dried beans for supper, and Eli split kindling by the stove. She thought about barrels. She thought about rope. She thought about the potatoes turning soft in the cellar bins, and the jars that would crack one by one through January and February until her shelves held nothing but broken glass and frozen pulp. She thought about what her father had shown her, and she began to calculate. If she could seal food inside tight barrels, truly tight, pitched and waxed against leakage, and lower those barrels through the ice into deep water, the lake itself might hold them at a temperature the cellar could no longer maintain. not warm, not room temperature, but above freezing. Above the line where potatoes turned black and jars burst, and 6 months of gathered food became useless. The idea was simple. The risk was enormous. If the barrels leaked, the food was ruined. If the ropes froze and snapped, the barrels were lost beneath the ice, unreachable until spring, if they could be found at all. If the ice shifted and crushed the barrels or dragged them under, everything was gone. Not half the food, the way the cellar threatened. All of it. Every potato, every carrot, every jar and sack and barrel surrendered to black water and irretrievable. She would be gambling her family's survival on a memory from childhood and a feeling in her hands. Marit Solheim arrived the next morning with a crock of rendered lard and a look that said she had come to check on more than supplies. Marit was 34, Tilda's nearest neighbor, a mother of 5 who understood winter arithmetic as well as anyone on the plain. She was not unkind. She was practical, which in Dakota Territory often looked the same. Tilda told her the plan. Marit set the lard crock on the table and stared at her. "You want to put your food in the lake?" Marit said. "Under the ice," Tilda said, "in sealed casks." "Dry food," Marit said, "in water. The water does not freeze down deep. My father showed me. The heaviest water sinks and it stays above freezing. If the barrels hold, the food stays cold but not frozen." Marit looked at the cellar door. She looked at the window where frost had built a white garden across the glass. She looked at Tilda with the particular expression of a woman who has cataloged every way a neighbor can die in winter and does not want to add a new one to the list. "Water ruins food," Marit said. "Barrels leak. You know they leak. Every barrel Martin ever owned leaked if you looked at it wrong. Ropes freeze, ice shifts. And you, one woman, alone, with 3 children and no ox, you're going to drag full casks onto a frozen lake and lower them into a hole. In this," she gestured at the window, at the wind, at everything. "Then why is the lake not frozen to the bottom?" Tilda asked. Marit did not have an answer for that. She picked up the lard crock, set it down again, and said, "Dry food belongs above ground or under it, not drowned." She left with the same worried look she had arrived with, plus a new worry she had not expected to carry home. Tilda watched her go. She understood Marit's objections because she shared every one of them. The barrels might leak. The ropes might freeze. The ice might shift. She might lose everything in a single desperate act that the whole town would remember as proof that widows make poor decisions. But the cellar wall was white with frost. Another jar had cracked overnight. And Bernd Halverson's math sat in her chest like a stone. If she lost half, she was begging by February. She could not make the cellar deeper. She could not make the winter shorter. She could not bring Martin back to finish what he had started. But the lake was 300 yards away, and the water below the ice was not frozen. She decided. Tilda needed barrels, pitch, rope, and help. The one man in town who controlled all 4 was Amos Bell. Bell's store sat at the center of De Smet like a spider in a web of debt. He sold flour, nails, rope, kerosene, and credit, and the credit was the part that made him powerful. Half the homesteaders within 10 miles owed him something: a flour account, a hardware tab, a note against next year's crop. Bell was 46, thick through the shoulders, and carried himself with the easy authority of a man who knew that hunger eventually brought everyone to his counter. He also held Tilda's flour debt. Martin had bought 6 sacks on account in September. The account was still open, and Bell knew, everyone knew, that if Tilda failed the winter, her claim would come available, and the land beside the lake was worth more than Martin had paid for it. Bell did not wish Tilda dead. He was not that kind of man, but he understood that her failure had a cash value, and he was exactly the kind of man who kept that number in his head while smiling at her across the counter. When Tilda came to the store and asked about used casks, Belle's eyebrows rose. When she explained what she needed them for, his eyebrows came back down, and a smile crossed his face that had nothing to do with kindness. "She's feeding the lake before she feeds her children," Belle said, loud enough for the four men around the stove to hear. The laughter was immediate and general. Not cruel laughter exactly. The laughter of men who have seen enough bad winters to know that desperation sometimes wears strange clothes. They laughed the way people laugh when they are relieved the foolishness belongs to someone else. Belle leaned on his counter. "Tilda," he said, "the casks will split. The lake will swallow them. Or spring rot will poison everything inside, and you will open those barrels in March to find soup where your potatoes were." He paused. He lowered his voice, but not enough to keep the men from hearing. "I will buy your remaining food stores at fair price today, and I will take your claim note off your hands for half value. You can take the children to your brother in Minnesota before the next storm." The offer sounded generous. It was designed to sound generous. It was also designed to strip Tilda of everything Martin had worked for and leave Belle with lakeside property and a profit on the flour debt. Tilda looked at the casks stacked against the back wall of the store. She looked at the coils of hemp rope hanging from ceiling hooks. She looked at Belle, who was still smiling. "I need 2 coils of rope and 4 casks," she said. "I will sign for the rope, not the cow, not the claim." Belle's smile thinned. "What will you sign against?" Tilda reached into her coat and produced Martin's silver watch. It was the only valuable thing she had left that was not food, land, or children. She set it on the counter. "The rope," she said, "and the 4 worst casks you have." Belle looked at the watch. He looked at Tilda. He took both, because a silver watch was worth more than 2 coils of rope and 4 barrels that had sat unsold since autumn, and because a woman who would trade her dead husband's watch for used casks was a woman who would be back at his counter by February, ready to sign anything. Tilda loaded the casks onto a borrowed hand sled. She carried the rope coils over her shoulders, one on each side. She did not look at the men around the stove. She walked into the wind and began pulling. Behind her, Belle said something else. She did not hear it, but the laughter followed her out the door and across the snow until the wind took it away. The casks sat in the lean-to beside the cow. 4 oak barrels, roughly 30-gallon capacity each, with iron hoops and pine staves. They were not new. They were not tight. One had a visible crack along a bottom stave. Another had a hoop so loose Tilda could fit 3 fingers between iron and wood. Belle had sold her the worst stock he had, and Tilda had known it when she picked them. But she had also known something Belle did not. She had watched her father repair barrels in the mill yard. She had handed him tools. She had listened to the sound a stave makes when tapped, the difference between tight and sprung, sealed and compromised. She could not build a barrel from scratch, but she could read one the way a doctor reads a pulse, by listening. She started the first evening after the children slept. She carried a lantern to the lean-to, set it on an overturned bucket, and began tapping staves. The cracked barrel was the worst. She would need new wood for the bottom stave, or pitch heavy enough to bridge the gap. The loose-hooped barrel needed driving. The iron bands hammered down the taper of the staves to compress the joints. She had a mallet. She did not have a Cooper's driver, the specialized tool that kept the hoop from jumping sideways under the hammer. She improvised with a flat piece of oak and a steady hand. The first hoop tightened. The second hoop jumped and gouged a line across the stave. She repositioned, braced the barrel between her knees and the wall, and drove again. Tighter. Not tight enough, but closer. The wind pressed against the lean-to wall. The cow shifted and breathed warm fog. The lantern flickered. Tilda had sealed 1 hoop and tested 3 staves when she heard a voice outside the lean-to that did not belong to Wind. "You are driving that hoop against the grain." She turned. A man stood in the doorway, lean and lame in one leg, wearing a coat that had been repaired more times than it had been washed. He held a lantern of his own, and in his other hand he carried a canvas roll that clinked softly when he moved. His name was Kittel Asen. He was 58 years old, a traveling cooper, and former lake fisherman from Wisconsin. He had come west mending barrels for merchants and grain dealers, working his way from town to town with his tools and his limp and his particular way of looking at wood as though it owed him a conversation. He slept in the livery when a town had one. He ate what people offered in exchange for barrel work. He was considered odd because he worked slowly and refused bad wood, which in a frontier town was like a carpenter refusing nails. He had been in Belle's store that afternoon. He had heard the laughter. He had followed Tilda not because he felt sorry for her, but because he had seen her behind the store earlier that day, before she went inside, tapping staves and listening, testing the wood before she committed to buying it. That was not desperation. That was competence. "Against the grain splits the stave at the hoop line," Kittel said. He set down his lantern and unrolled the canvas. Inside were cooper's tools, a driving iron, a crow's, a howl, 2 sizes of heading knife, and a small draw knife worn smooth at the handles. "Drive with the grain, and the wood compresses instead of splitting." Tilda looked at the tools. She looked at Kittel. She looked at the barrel between her knees with its gouged stave. "I know what I am building," she said. "Are you going to tell me it is foolish?" Kittel picked up the barrel, turned it, and tapped the cracked bottom stave with his fingernail. He listened. He tapped again, higher. He tilted his head the way a dog tilts at an unfamiliar sound. "This stave is dead," he said, "but the 3 beside it are sound. If you replace this one and pitch the seam, the barrel will hold water. Whether the idea is foolish depends on how deep you sink it and how well you seal the lid." He looked at her. His eyes were pale and steady in the lantern light. "Show me what you have planned," he said, "and I will tell you where the barrels will fail." It was not an offer of charity. It was a transaction between someone who understood wood and someone who understood water, and neither of them had time to be polite about it. Tilda showed him the casks. She explained the plan: sealed barrels, weighted with stones, lowered through ice on hemp rope, anchored to willow posts at the shore. Kittel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked 3 questions. How deep was the lake at the anchor point? Tilda said she did not know exactly, but the bottom dropped fast. A stone on a string had not touched bottom at 20 feet. How cold was the water below the ice? Tilda said it moved and did not freeze. Her father had shown her. How long did the food need to stay under? Tilda said 4 months, maybe 5. Kittel was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The barrels will not fail from the water. Water pressure helps a cask. It pushes the staves together. The barrels will fail from the ice. Ice moves. Ice expands. If the rope freezes to the ice edge and the ice shifts, it will pull the lid or snap the line. You need the ropes to pass through the ice without touching the freeze line." He picked up his driving iron. "I can show you how to swell a cask so the staves seat before you pitch them. I can show you which of these barrels will hold and which will kill your food. But you will have to work. I cannot kneel on this leg long enough to do it myself." Outside, the wind drove snow against the lean-to and waves. Inside, the lanterns made a small country of warmth. Tilda handed him the mallet. "Show me," she said. They worked until the lanterns burned low. Kittel showed her how to pour hot water inside a cask and let the staves swell before driving the hoops to their final position. He showed her how to identify a sprung stave by sound. A dead stave thudded, a sound stave rang. He demonstrated how to seat a hoop tighter using the driving iron at an angle that distributed force evenly, so the oak compressed without cracking. He showed her that pitch must be warmed slowly over a low flame. Cold pitch shatters, and overheated pitch runs thin and misses the seam. By midnight, one barrel was fully reseated, pitched at the base seam, and standing in a bucket of water to test for leaks. Kittle declared the cracked stave barrel beyond saving without a replacement stave. He took it apart, selected the 3 good staves, and set them aside for patches. "1 barrel done," Tilda said. "I need 5. "You have 4, Kittle said. "1 is dead. You need to find another, or make the 3 survivors carry everything." The cow shifted in the dark. Nels coughed from inside the cabin, a sound that crossed the cold air between the buildings like a thrown stone. Tilda looked toward the cabin, then back at the barrels. "Tomorrow," Kittle said. "Pitch needs 12 hours to cure in this cold, and the boy needs you more than the staves do tonight." He rolled his tools, tucked them under his arm, and limped back toward town without asking for food or thanks. At the edge of the lamplight, he stopped. "You hear wood well," he said. "Most people who tap barrels are just making noise. You were listening." Then he was gone, and Tilda was alone with 4 casks, one of them already holding water, and a plan that had just moved from desperation to something that might be called possible. But the frost in the cellar had reached the floor. She had checked before supper. A white crust, thin as paper, spreading from the east wall across the packed earth toward the bins. The potatoes on the east side were softer than yesterday. 2 more jars had developed hairline cracks along their seams. The cellar was dying by degrees, and Tilda had exactly as much time as the cold allowed, not 1 day more. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who did not understand what you were building? Kittle returned at first light. He brought with him a cracked barrel he had found behind the livery, a molasses cask with a split head but sound staves. He had already pulled it apart and selected the 2 staves that matched the diameter of Tilda's dead barrel. He set them against the lean-to wall and said, "These will need shaving. Your drawn knife is dull." "I do not have a drawn knife," Tilda said. He handed her his. They worked through the morning while Eli watched from the doorway with Nels bundled against his hip. Kittle sat on an upturned crate because his leg would not allow him to kneel for long, and he directed Tilda's hands with a patience that had nothing to do with gentleness. He was precise. He corrected her twice on the angle of the shave, and once on the pressure she applied to the crows, the groove cut inside the barrel head where the lid would seat. "Too deep and the lid rattles," he said. "Too shallow and water finds the gap. You want the wood to grip the lid the way a hand grips a rope. Firm, not tight. Tight cracks." By noon, the replacement staves were fitted into the dead barrel's frame. Kittle showed her how to swell them with hot water poured slowly along the inside seam, letting the wood drink and expand until the joints closed. Then the hoops, driven down in sequence, bottom hoop first, then bilge, then quarter, each one compressing the staves another fraction of an inch. Tilda drove the hoops. Kittle listened. After each strike, he either nodded or said, "Again." When the sound changed, when the ring of iron on iron shifted from loose to seated, he said, "There, that is what tight sounds like. Remember it." She remembered it. By the end of the first day, 2 barrels were sealed and standing in water buckets. No leaks. The 3rd barrel, the one with the loose hoops she had gouged on the first night, needed new pitch along the damaged stave. Kittle warmed pine pitch over the cabin stove in a tin cup, stirring it slowly with a stick until it ran like dark honey. Cold pitch is glass, he said. Hot pitch is water. You want it between, warm enough to flow into the seam, cool enough to grip when it sets. If you rush the heat, it goes thin and runs past the joint. If you let it cool too fast, it bridges the gap without filling it, and the first pressure crack opens the whole line. He poured. The pitch settled into the gouge mark and the stave seam beneath it, black and slow. The smell filled the lean-to, sharp, resinous, a smell like forests burning in miniature. 12 hours, Kittle said, then test it. Day 2 brought a setback that had nothing to do with barrels. Nels woke burning with fever. His cough had deepened overnight into something wet and constant, a sound that made Ragna cover her ears and Eli stand very still by the stove with his fists clenched. Tilda wrapped Nels in every blanket she had, boiled water with dried mint from the pantry stores, and held a steaming cloth near his face while he breathed in shallow, rattling pulls. She could not go to the lean-to. She could not work the barrels. She sat with her son against her chest and listened to the wind outside and the fever inside and counted the hours she was losing. Kittle came to the cabin door at midday. He looked at Nels. He looked at Tilda. He did not say anything about the barrels. He said, "I will test the pitch seam. You stay." He tested it. The seam held. He came back and told her so, and then he told her something else. "Bell sent a boy to the livery this morning, asked how many casks I was working on and where they were going. The boy counted the barrels in your lean-to through the door gap." Tilda closed her eyes. Bell was keeping inventory of her desperation, counting her chances so he could calculate when she would break. "How many does he think I have?" she asked. "The boy counted 4, Kittle said. 1 in pieces." "Good," Tilda said. "Let him count." Day 3. Nels's fever held, but did not climb. Tilda left him with Eli and went back to the lean-to. 3 barrels sealed. The 4th, the repaired one with replacement staves, needed its lid set and pitched. Kittle arrived with beeswax he had traded for at the livery, scraps from a harness maker's stock. He showed Tilda how to mix beeswax with tallow and work it into linen strips to create a secondary seal inside the lid channel. "Pitch alone cracks in deep cold," he said. "Wax and tallow stay flexible. They do not hold water out forever, but they buy time. If the pitch fails at a seam, the wax cloth catches it." They lined the lid channels of all 4 barrels with waxed linen. The work was slow. Each strip had to be pressed into the crow's groove with a blunt tool, overlapping the previous strip by half its width, then sealed with a thin layer of warmed pitch on top. "Why do you know this?" Tilda asked while they worked. It was the first personal question she had asked him. Kittle did not look up from the groove. "I fished lake sturgeon in Wisconsin for 9 years before I took up coopering. We kept fish in barrels sunk in lake water through autumn to sell fresh at winter markets. The barrels that leaked cost me more than the barrels that held ever earned." "You have done this before," Tilda said, "sinking barrels." "Fish," Kittle said, "not flour. Fish do not mind getting wet." It was not a joke, exactly. It was an acknowledgement that what Tilda was attempting was harder than anything he had done, and that his knowledge applied only so far. The rest was hers. That afternoon, Tilda found a 5th barrel. Mart Solheim's oldest daughter, Guro, appeared at the cabin with a bundle of clean linen strips and a message that her mother did not want Tilda's children hungry, even if she thought Tilda was wrong. Tucked behind the linen was information. A neighbor 3 miles north had a pork barrel sitting empty in his barn. He would trade it for 2 days of owed labor come spring. Tilda walked 3 miles north in wind that cut through her coat like a blade through linen. She walked 3 miles back, dragging the barrel on a rope behind her. The barrel was rough, a slack cask, not tight cooperage, But Kittle examined it that evening and said the staves were honest oak. It could be made to hold 5 barrels, 5 chances. Days 4 and 5 blurred into a rhythm of pitch and rope and iron. Kittle taught Tilda to pack the barrels in layers, root crops bedded in clean straw, jars wrapped individually in linen and nestled upright in straw nests, flour and beans sealed inside a separate cask, raised on an inner slat frame he built from scrap pine. The slat frame held the dry goods above the bottom of the barrel so that if any water did seep past the seals, it would pool beneath the frame instead of reaching the sacks. Water forgives carrots faster than flour, Kittle said. A wet carrot is still a carrot. Wet flour is paste. They marked each rope with a system of knots, 1 knot for potatoes and carrots, 2 for apples, 3 for salted pork, 4 for jars, 5 for dry goods. Tilda practiced identifying the knots in mittens in darkness by feel alone. Kittle made her do it with her eyes closed until she could name each barrel by touch in under 10 seconds. Crisis never arrives politely, he said. You will not retrieve these in daylight with bare hands and calm wind. You will retrieve them half frozen, half blind, with a child screaming inside the cabin. The knots must be in your fingers, not your eyes. On the 5th day, they ran the first real test. Kittle selected the smallest barrel, the repaired one with replacement staves, and they filled it with stones to approximate the weight of a loaded cask. Tilda chopped the ice hole wider, a process that took 40 minutes of hatchet work in wind that numbed her hands through double mittens. The ice was now 10 inches thick. Below it, the water moved, dark and patient. They lowered the test barrel on a weighted rope. It sank slowly, turning once as the current caught it. The rope paid out through Tilda's hands, 20 feet, 25. The stones inside shifted and the barrel tilted, and for a moment the rope jerked sideways as though something below had grabbed it. Then it steadied. The rope hung taut from the ice edge, disappearing into black water. Kittle tied the shore end to a willow post driven into the frozen bank and marked the rope with a strip of red cloth. Leave it overnight, he said. If the rope holds and the barrel holds, you have your answer. If the ice freezes the rope to the edge, we learn that too. Tilda slept badly. She checked Nell's 3 times. She checked the cellar once and found 2 more potatoes soft on the east side. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind and imagined the barrel turning slowly in black water 25 feet below the ice. At dawn, she went to the lake. The red cloth was still there, stiff with frost but visible. The rope was rimed with ice where it passed through the hole, but the hole itself had not frozen shut. The current below kept the water moving enough to resist a full seal. She pulled. The rope came up hard, coated in ice crystals that shattered as she hauled, hand over hand. The weight was enormous, heavier than when it went down, or so it felt through frozen mittens and arms that had not rested properly in days. The barrel broke the surface, trailing black water. She dragged it onto the ice. The hoops were intact. The staves were intact. The pitch seams showed no cracks. She pried the lid. Inside, the stones sat in a shallow pool of water, perhaps a cup's worth, that had seeped through one seam near the bilge hoop. 1 cup, in an overnight submersion. Kittle arrived while she was staring at the water pooled among the stones. He looked at the barrel. He looked at the seam. He pressed his thumbnail into the pitch line where the seepage had occurred. That seam was the repaired one, he said. The replacement stave sits a quarter hair proud of its neighbor. The pitch bridged it but did not fill it. I can fix that with a second pitch layer and a wax cloth wrap on the outside. 1 cup, Tilda said. 1 cup is not nothing, Kittle said. But 1 cup in a barrel of straw-packed potatoes means wet straw at the outer edge. It does not mean frozen potatoes. He paused. It is not perfect, but your cellar is not perfect either, and the cellar is losing. They repitched the seam. They wrapped the outside with waxed linen below the waterline mark. They tested again for a second night. This time, the seepage was less than a tablespoon. Bernd Halverson appeared on the 6th day. He had heard, everyone had heard, about the barrels and the lake. He walked to Tilda's cabin with his ground probe and his lantern, in the same forward-leaning posture that made him look like he was walking into a wind that existed only for him. He did not go to the lean-to. He went to the lake. Tilda found him standing at the ice hole, looking down. The test barrel's rope hung in the water, marked with its red cloth. Bernd had pulled it up an inch or two and let it drop back. He was feeling the weight. An empty test barrel is not a winter supply, Bernd said without turning around. I know, Tilda said. A crock of butter is not a winter supply. I know that too. Bernd turned. His face was unreadable, not hostile, not encouraging, evaluating. You know what happens if the ropes freeze into the ice and you cannot pull them? I lose the food. You lose all the food. Not half. Not the amount the cellar would have taken. Everything. At once. The cellar has already taken it, Tilda said. 2 more jars cracked yesterday. The east side potatoes are soft. Your forecast is coming true, Bernd. The only question is whether I let the cellar finish the job or try something else before there is nothing left to try with. Bernd looked at the rope. He looked at the ice hole. He looked at the sky, which was the color of iron and promised nothing good. I have seen many desperate ideas in bad winters, he said. Desperation often wears the face of cleverness. He paused. But I have also never seen anyone test a barrel overnight before loading it. That is not desperation. That is method. He walked away without saying whether she should continue. He did not need to. The fact that he had come to look, that he had felt the rope, said everything his words did not. On the 7th day, Tilda loaded the first real cask. She and Kittle had spent the previous evening packing. 11 bushels of potatoes bedded in clean straw, the firmest ones selected by hand, each one pressed and examined before it went into the barrel. They packed them tight so they could not shift and crack against each other during submersion. The lid went on. The pitch went around the seam. The waxed linen went over the pitch. The stone weights were tied to the bottom of the barrel in a rope net so the cask would hang upright in the water instead of tumbling. They lowered it at dawn. The loaded barrel was heavier than anything Tilda had pulled or pushed since Martin's death. It took both of them on the rope, Tilda hauling and Kittle bracing the line against the ice lip with a board to prevent the rope from sawing a groove that would weaken the edge. The barrel sank. The rope paid out. 30 feet down, the weight steadied. They tied off and marked the line. Tilda stood at the ice hole and looked into the black water where her potatoes had gone. She could not see the barrel. She could not see anything below the first 2 feet of green dark water. Her children's food was down there, invisible, held by rope and pitch and the strange behavior of water near freezing. She went back to the cabin and found Eli standing at the window, watching. "Where did the potatoes go?" he asked. "Somewhere the cold cannot reach them," Tilda said. "Can we get them back?" "Yes." She said it with more certainty than she felt, but Eli was 9, and 9-year-olds need certainty the way barrels need hoops, not because it changes the shape of things, but because it holds them together. Over the next 2 days, they loaded and sank 3 more barrels, apples and remaining potatoes, salted pork, and the jars of preserves packed in straw so thick each jar was a fist's width from its neighbor. The fifth barrel, dry goods, flour, and beans on the raised slat frame, went down last. Kittle checked every seal twice before allowing it into the water. He made Tilda test the knots in her mittens one final time. 5 ropes hung from the ice, each marked with a different color of cloth. 5 barrels sat in the dark water below, weighted and sealed and invisible. The cellar still held onions, the last sack of flour she had kept back for daily use, and the compromised east side potatoes that were already too soft to store, but still edible if cooked immediately. Tilda had put her family's survival into a frozen lake. The only thing between her children and starvation was pitch, rope, and her father's lesson about the weight of cold water. The cold deepened. The blizzards that had come in pairs now came in threes, storm after storm, rolling across the plain with barely a day between them. The temperature fell in stages, each drop a new lesson in what cold could do. Firewood became currency. Neighbors stopped visiting. The town pulled inward like a fist closing. On a morning in late January, Tilda descended into the cellar and found the remaining flour sack crusted with frost. The onions beside it had frozen in their skins. The east side potatoes were black. She climbed out and closed the cellar door. The cellar was finished. Whatever it had once been able to protect was gone. The only food left was in the lake. From the cabin window she could see the ice hole, a dark spot on the white surface 300 yards away. 5 ropes, 5 chances. The lake held everything now. Then the real cold came. It arrived on the 2nd of February, and it arrived the way death arrives, not announced, not gradual, but present. The sky went white. The wind stopped. The air became a solid thing, a weight that pressed against the cabin walls and squeezed through every crack and nail hole and gap in the horse blanket door. The thermometer on the porch post, Martin's thermometer, nailed up the day they arrived, read 22 below zero at dawn. By noon, it had stopped moving because the mercury had contracted past the lowest mark. Tilda stuffed every rag she owned into the walls. She burned furniture, a stool Martin had built, a shelf she did not need. She kept the stove fed until the firewood stack beside the door shrank visibly between morning and evening. Nels coughed against her shoulder. Ragna sat on the bed with her coat on and her hands inside her sleeves and did not speak. Eli fed the stove with the mechanical focus of a child who understands that the fire is the only thing standing between his family and the cold. The sound came at night, a sharp crack from the cellar, loud as a pistol shot. Tilda knew what it was before she opened the door. Another jar. She went down the ladder and found 3 jars burst in a line along the back shelf, their contents frozen into jagged columns of purple and brown. Glass shards lay in the frost like teeth. The cellar was not just failing, it was destroying what remained. Across town, the same catastrophe was unfolding behind every door. Marit Solheim lost her cellar on the same night. Her potatoes froze solid. 20 bushels of work turned to black mush in a single drop. She arrived at Tilda's door the next morning with her youngest daughter, both of them white-faced and silent. The daughter was running a fever. "My cellar's gone," Marit said. "Everything on the east side. The jars, the carrots, most of the potatoes." She paused. Burnt says his lower bins held, but his outer stores failed too. Bell's store lost jars near the back wall when his stove went out overnight. She looked at Tilda. The look contained everything she had said a month earlier about dry food belonging above ground. It also contained the knowledge that she had been wrong. "Is your food still down there?" Merritt asked. "I have not checked," Tilda said. "I have been afraid to check." That was the truth. For 2 days, while the cold pressed down and the cellar burst and the firewood shrank, Tilda had not gone to the lake. She had stared at the ice hole from the window, watching the red cloth marker stiffen in the wind, and she had not gone. Because as long as she did not pull the rope, the food was alive in her mind: potatoes firm, jars whole, apples intact. The moment she pulled and found ruin, the last door closed. But Nels needed food. Ragna needed food. Eli needed food. And Marit's daughter needed food. And Marit had none to give. Tilda went to the lake on the morning of the 4th of February. The cold was unspeakable. She wore every piece of clothing she owned and still felt the air reach through to her skin as though fabric were rumor. The walk from the cabin to the ice hole, 300 yards, took 20 minutes because the snow had crusted into ridges that caught her boots, and because the wind had returned, a low, steady push from the northwest that turned exposed skin white in minutes. The ice hole had crusted over. A disk of new ice, 2 inches thick, sealed the opening. She chopped it with the hatchet, each swing sending shocks up her arms into her shoulders. The hatchet bit through. Black water appeared below, and the sight of it, liquid, moving, alive, made her breath catch. She found the first rope, 1 knot, potatoes and carrots. She pulled. The rope was stiff. Ice crystals coated it in a sleeve that cracked and fell as she hauled, raining shards onto her mittens and sleeves. The weight below was enormous. Her boots slid on the ice. She braced 1 foot against a pressure ridge and pulled with her whole body, leaning back until the rope cut into her palms through the mittens. The barrel rose. She felt it bump against the underside of the ice where the hole was too narrow. She chopped the hole wider with 1 hand while holding the rope with the other, a maneuver that required her to drop to her knees and swing the hatchet sideways. Ice chips sprayed across her face. The wind took them. The barrel came through. It broke the surface streaming water that froze on contact with the air, coating the staves in a glaze that crackled as she dragged it onto the ice. The hoops were intact. The pitch was intact. The waxed linen below the waterline was dark and wet and unbroken. She pried the lid with the iron bar. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, though fear was there, but from cold and effort and the weight of what the next 30 seconds would decide. The straw inside was wet at the outer edge. A ring of dampness, perhaps an inch deep, circled the packed interior where a small amount of water had found its way past the seals over the weeks of submersion. But the straw in the center was dry, and beneath the straw, the potatoes sat firm and pale and cold and whole. Tilda picked one up. It was cold, profoundly cold, but it was not frozen. It did not give when she pressed it. The skin was tight. She pulled the small knife from her belt and cut it in half. The flesh inside was pale, clean, dense, not black, not sweet-smelling, not crystallized. A potato, a living, edible potato, pulled from 30 feet of dark water in the worst cold she had ever felt. She carried it back to the cabin. She set the halves on the table. Eli touched the cut flesh with 1 finger. He started crying. Not loud, not dramatic. The quiet tears of a child who has understood for weeks that something terrible was possible and has just learned that it did not happen. Ragna picked up the other half and held it against her cheek the way a smaller child holds a doll. Nels reached for it from Tilda's arms and said a word that might have been eat. Tilda boiled potatoes that morning. She boiled enough for her children and for Marit's daughter, who ate 3 small pieces and then fell asleep with her head on Marit's arm. Marit sat at Tilda's table and watched her children eat food that had come from the bottom of a frozen lake. She did not say she had been wrong. She said something harder. "Show me the ropes," she said. "Show me which knots mean which barrel. Show me how deep they sit. If you are invested in this story, stay with us, because what happens next changes everything. Tilda went back. She went back in the cold that froze the hair inside her nostrils and turned her eyelashes to tiny weights. She went back because one barrel was not proof. One barrel was luck. She needed all 5. She pulled the apple barrel next. The apples were cold and firm. 3 on the outer edge had softened slightly where the damp straw touched them, but they were not frozen and not rotted. She cut one open. The flesh was white, tinged with cold, and it tasted like an apple. The pork barrel came up heavier than the others. The brine had kept the salt pork stable, and the seal on this cask, the tightest of the 5, the one Kittle had pitched twice, showed no seepage at all. The pork was cold, dense, and preserved exactly as it had been the day it went under. The jar barrel took the longest to retrieve. It was the deepest set of the 5, and the rope had developed a kink where it passed through the ice edge. Tilda worked the kink loose with numb fingers, pulling sideways, then down, then up, trying to free the line without snapping it. The rope burned through her palms. She could feel skin separating from flesh under the mittens, a sensation that was more pressure than pain because the cold had taken the sharpness out of everything. The barrel came up. She pried the lid, expecting shattered glass. The jars sat in their straw nests, upright, intact, sealed. Every one. 30 jars of preserved plums and chokecherries, cold as stones but whole. The dry goods barrel was last, the one Kittle had worried about most, the one with the raised slat frame and the double seal and the warning that wet flour was paste, not food. Tilda pulled it and felt the weight shift inside as it rose, the sacks moving on the frame, sliding toward the low side. She opened it on the ice, kneeling in the wind. The outer linen was damp. The pitch had held at every seam except one, a hairline crack near the second hoop where the cold had contracted the wood a fraction beyond the pitch's flexibility. A thin line of moisture traced the inside of the barrel below the crack. But the slat frame had done its work. The water had pooled beneath the frame, not above it. The flour sacks sat on pine slats an inch above the seepage. Tilda opened the nearest sack. The flour at the very bottom, where it touched the slat, was slightly clumped. Everything above it was dry. 5 barrels, 5 retrievals, food for months. She knelt on the ice with the open flour sack in her hands, and the wind driving snow across the lake in sheets, and she understood with perfect clarity that her father had been right. The water obeyed rules, the cold obeyed rules, and the people who survived were the ones who learned the rules before the rules learned them. Not everyone had been so careful. Not everyone had been so fortunate. Torgrim Flaten, a bachelor farmer who lived alone 4 miles east, was found on the morning of the 5th of February by a man delivering firewood. Torgrim lay in the snow between his cabin and the next homestead, half a mile from either door. He had tried to walk for food after his cellar stores froze solid. The cold had taken his fingers white and his thinking slow. He was alive when they found him. Barely. They carried him to a neighbor's stove and wrapped his hands and feet in warm cloth and fed him broth a spoonful at a time. He lived. But the image of Torgrim Flaten lying in the snow, a man with a full cellar in October reduced to crawling through a blizzard in February, traveled through the community faster than any gossip about barrels and lakes. People began to understand. The cellars had failed. The food that was supposed to last until spring had frozen and burst and rotted in the ground. And one woman, the widow they had laughed about at Bell's store, had food, firm potatoes, whole jars, dry flour, edible apples in February. The laughter had stopped. What replaced it was something more complicated than respect. It was need. Tilda shared food with Marit's family. She gave potatoes to the family that had traded her the fifth barrel. She sent a jar of plums to Torgrim Flotten's neighbor, with instructions to feed him slowly. She did not share with everyone. She could not. The food in the lake was finite, and her children came first, and 3 small mouths would eat through 5 barrels faster than generosity could afford. But she shared what she could, and the fact that she shared anything, after the mockery, after Belle's laughter, after the storemen and their certainty, meant something to the people who received it. Bernd Halvorsen came to the lake. He did not come to praise Tilda. He came to measure. He inspected the rope knots. He examined the cast seams. He cut open a retrieved carrot and studied the cross-section, looking for the crystal damage that deep cold leaves in the cell walls of root vegetables. The carrot was clean, cold, wet on the outside, but structurally intact. Bernd stood on the ice with the carrot in his hand and the wind in his face and said the hardest words a man who has been right about the cellar can say. "I was right about the cellar," Bernd said. "I was wrong about the lake." The morning after Bernd Halvorsen stood on the ice and admitted he had been wrong about the lake, 3 families came to Tilda's cabin before noon. The first was a young German couple, the Renners, who had arrived in Dakota Territory the previous spring and understood almost nothing about plains winters. Their cellar was shallow, shallower even than Tilda's, and their potatoes had frozen a week before Marit's. They brought a butter crock and 2 cracked jars and asked if Tilda could teach them what she had done. Their youngest child sat on the husband's hip, chewing the corner of a wool scarf. The second was a widower named Peter Stensland, 60 years old, who had wintered on the plains for a decade and lost cellar stores for the first time. He did not bring questions. He brought a barrel. He set it in Tilda's lean-to and said, "Tell me what is wrong with it." The third was a woman Tilda had never spoken to, a Swede named Karen, whose husband was stuck 40 miles west, unable to travel because the rail line had not run in 3 weeks. Karen had 5 children and a cellar that held nothing edible except salted fish. She stood in Tilda's doorway and said nothing for a long time, and then she asked if the lake could keep fish from spoiling. Tilda answered each one. She told the Renners that shallow water would not work. The barrels needed to hang deep, below the current where temperature stayed steady. She told Peter that his barrel had a sprung stave at the 3rd hoop. She tapped it, and he heard the dead thud Kittel had taught her to recognize. She told Karen that salted fish in a sealed cask would hold in the lake as well as anything, provided the cask was tight and the lid was pitched. She explained things she had learned only weeks before, as though she had known them all her life. She did not feel like an expert. She felt like a woman repeating her father's words and Kittel's lessons, translating them into instructions simple enough that a frightened person could follow them in a blizzard. Marit Solheim's conversion did not arrive in a single scene. It arrived in stages, each one more reluctant than the last, because Marit was the kind of woman who would rather eat boiled leather than admit she had been wrong about something practical. The first stage had happened at Tilda's table, when Marit's daughter ate potatoes that had come from the lake. The second happened the following day, when Marit returned with her 2 oldest sons and asked to see the ropes. Tilda walked her to the lake. She showed her the 5 anchor posts, the color-coded cloth markers, the knot system. She pulled one rope part way and let Marit feel the weight, the taut, steady pull of a barrel hanging in deep water. Marit gripped the rope and held it for a long time, feeling the vibration of the current transmitted through the hemp. "It is not warm down there," Marit said. It was not a question. "No," Tilda said. "It is cold, but it is a different cold. It does not freeze." Marit released the rope. She looked at the ice, at the water visible through the chopped hole, at the 5 ropes disappearing into the dark. "My potatoes froze in the ground," Marit said. "Yours did not freeze in the water." She paused. "That makes no sense." "It makes sense if you know how water behaves near freezing," Tilda said. The heaviest water is not the coldest water. It sinks and holds near 39 degrees. The cellar has no such rule. The cellar follows the air. Marit was quiet. Then she said, Guro told me not to bring the linen. I almost did not send her. I thought you were... She stopped. You thought I was drowning my food, Tilda said. Yes. I thought so too, Tilda said, for the first 3 days. That was the moment Marit crossed over. Not because Tilda had proven her wrong, but because Tilda had admitted sharing the same doubt. It was harder to dismiss a woman who had been frightened by her own idea and done it anyway than a woman who had been certain all along. The teaching expanded. Tilda could not build barrels for every family. She could not pitch seams or drive hoops for people she had never met. What she could do was show them what to look for and what to avoid, and that turned out to be more valuable than any single barrel. She established rules, not from authority, she had none, but from the specifics of what had worked and what had almost failed. The water must be deep. Shallow water near the shore could freeze in a severe cold snap. The barrels needed to hang below the ice movement zone, at least 15 feet down. Deeper was better. Deeper was the casks must be tight. Loose cooperage, the slack barrels used for dry goods on land, would leak within days. Only tight cooperage, pitched and sealed, could hold. If a stave thudded when tapped, the barrel was not safe. Dry goods must be separated and elevated. The slat frame inside the barrel was not a luxury. It was the difference between dry flour and paste. Flour, beans, and cornmeal went in their own cask, on their own frame, sealed with double pitch and wax linen. Ropes must be checked. A frozen rope was not a lost rope, but a rope that froze to the ice edge could saw through when the ice shifted. The anchor posts must be driven deep, and the ropes must pass through the ice hole without touching the sides. She taught these rules to anyone who came. She showed Petter how to fix his sprung stave. She showed the renners how to test pitch by pressing a thumbnail into the seam. If the pitch cracked under the nail, it was too cold and needed rewarming. She showed Karin how to wrap her fish casks with linen strips below the waterline. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it before the hard season comes. She did not charge. She did not trade. She gave the knowledge away, and the knowledge spread from her cabin to the lake, to the town, to the farms beyond, carried by the desperation of people who had watched their cellars fail and needed another way. Within 2 weeks, 9 families had barrels in the lake. Not all of them survived. The Renner's first cask leaked badly because they had used a barrel with a warped head that did not seat properly in the crows. Peter's cask held, but his rope froze into the ice during a 4-day cold snap, and he spent an entire morning chipping it free with a chisel. Karin lost a small crock of butter when her son tied the anchor knot incorrectly, and the current dragged it under during a pressure shift. But the successes outnumbered the failures. Potatoes came up firm. Pork came up preserved. Jars came up whole. Families that had faced weeks of hunger with no alternative now had food they could reach, food that the cold could not destroy, food that sat in dark water and waited to be needed. Amos Bell watched all of this from his store. He watched the families come to Tilda's cabin instead of his counter. He watched them carry barrels past his door without stopping. He watched the credit accounts he had counted on, the desperate purchases of flour at doubled prices, the claim notes signed under duress, the slow transfer of land from failed homesteaders to his ledger, evaporate as Tilda's method gave people an option that did not require his permission. Bell was not a man who lost quietly. He adjusted. He began selling casks at triple their autumn price. He told customers that only his barrels were safe, that used casks and barn barrels would leak and rot and poison the food inside. He claimed that improper sealing was the reason the renter's cask had failed, and that Tilda's instructions were unreliable because she was not a trained cooper. Tilda heard about this from Pater, who had been in the store when Bell made the claim. She did not go to the store. She did not confront Bell directly. Instead, she did something more effective. She taught people how to test barrels before buying them. She showed them the tap test, dead thud for sprung, clear ring for sound. She showed them how to check a crow's groove with a finger for depth and evenness. She showed them how to spot a warped head by laying it flat and looking for light gaps at the rim. She showed them everything Kittle had taught her, and she gave it to them for free, and the effect on Bell's triple-priced inventory was immediate. Families who had planned to buy from Bell at any price now inspected his stock and rejected half of it. 2 men returned barrels they had already purchased after discovering sprung staves. Bell's profit margin on casks collapsed. He blamed Tilda. He told anyone who would listen that she was undermining his business, that her lake method was a temporary trick that would fail in spring, that the food would come up rotten and poisoned when the ice melted. He said these things at his store, at the livery, at the church. He said them with the practiced confidence of a man who understood that volume and repetition could substitute for truth. But the potatoes were firm, the jars were whole, and the people eating lake-stored food in February were not interested in Bell's opinion about what they should have done instead. Tilda organized the lake. It needed organizing. 9 families chopping separate ice holes across the same stretch of shore created a hazard. Too many weak points too close together, ropes crossing, anchor posts interfering with neighbors' lines. She walked the shoreline with Berndt and Pater and marked out 6 stations, each spaced 30 yards apart, each with a designated anchor zone and a shared retrieval path cleared of snow. The marking took a full day. She used willow stakes driven into the ice with colored cloth strips, red for potatoes, blue for pork, yellow for dry goods. The system looked simple from the shore. From inside the work, it was a negotiation. Pater wanted his station closest to his cabin, which put it on shallow water. Tilda refused. The Renners wanted to share a station with Karen, which meant too many ropes through one hole. Tilda separated them. She discovered something Kittel had told her weeks ago, and she had not understood at the time. Knowing a thing is not the same as being able to teach it to frighten people. The families who came to her were not students. They were parents with hungry children and frozen cellars and no patience for explanations that took longer than the cold allowed. They wanted answers, not understanding. Tilda had to give them both, because an answer without understanding would fail the first time conditions changed. She and Kittle argued about this. It happened on the afternoon she was teaching the Renner family to pack their replacement barrel. The husband was rushing, stuffing potatoes into straw without checking for soft spots, jamming the lid down without clearing the crow's groove of ice crystals that had formed overnight. Tilda stopped him and made him remove the lid and start again. Kittle, watching from his crate, said, "Let him learn by failure. A leaking barrel teaches faster than a lecture." "He does not have a second barrel," Tilda said. "If this one fails, his children eat nothing." "Then he should learn to listen," Kittle said. "He is frightened," Tilda said. "Frightened people do not listen. They hurry. If I let him hurry, the barrel leaks. If the barrel leaks, his children are hungry. The failure teaches nothing because there is no second chance to apply the lesson." Kittle was quiet. The Renner husband stood between them, holding a potato, looking from one to the other. "You're right," Kittle said finally. "In Wisconsin, a leaking fish barrel cost money. Here, a leaking food barrel costs lives. The margin is different." It was the only time Kittle admitted she understood something about this work that he did not. Not the coopering, he would always know wood better than she did. But the stakes. The distance between a tradesman's loss and a mother's loss. That distance changed how you taught. Kittel Asen had been coughing since before the worst cold came. It was a dry cough at first, the kind that lives in the chest of anyone who sleeps in unheated barns and works with cold hands in open air. Tilda had noticed it during the barrel construction and said nothing because Kittel was the kind of man who would have dismissed concern the way he dismissed bad wood, with a tap and a shake of the head. But the cough changed after the crisis. It deepened. It became wet. It woke him at night in the livery, where he slept wrapped in horse blankets beside the stove that the liveryman kept burning for the animals. By mid-February, the cough had a sound that Tilda recognized from Nels's illness, the sound of lungs filling with what they should not contain. Kittel came to the cabin less frequently. When he came, he sat instead of standing. He held his tools but worked slowly, and the work he did was more instruction than labor. He watched Tilda drive hoops and said less, correcting only when the sound told him something her hands had missed. One afternoon, while Tilda was teaching Marit's sons how to lower a cask without shocking the stave seams, slowly, with the rope paying through a board brace, letting the water receive the barrel instead of dropping it, Kittel sat on the overturned crate in the lean-to and told her about Wisconsin. He had been a lake fisherman for 9 winters. Sturgeon, mostly. Massive ancient fish that lived in the deep cold and came to the nets slowly, as though they were doing the fishermen a favor. He had lost 2 boats, a partner, and most of the feeling in his left foot to the work. The limp came from a logging accident afterward, a tree that fell wrong and pinned his leg for 3 hours before anyone found him. "I was alone," he said, "the way you were alone when I found you in the lean-to. Not abandoned, just alone. There is a difference." Tilda did not ask him to explain the difference. She understood it. Abandoned meant someone had chosen to leave. Alone meant the world had arranged itself so that no one was there. The distinction mattered because it determined whether you spent your energy on anger or on work. "You did not come to the lean-to because you felt sorry for me," Tilda said. "No," Kittel said. "I came because you were listening to the wood. Most people who tap barrels are making noise. You were hearing something." He coughed. It was a long cough, the kind that bends a man forward and does not let him straighten until it decides to stop. When it stopped, Kittel wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and looked at the blood on his knuckle. He looked at it for a moment. Then he put his hand in his pocket. "The staves on the Renner barrel," he said, as though nothing had happened. "They used green oak. Green oak shrinks as it dries, and it dries even in cold if the wind reaches it. Tell them to use seasoned wood or accept the leaking." Kittel died on the 26th of February. He died in the livery, on a bed of straw the liveryman had arranged beside the warmest stove, with his cooper's tools rolled in their canvas beside him. The liveryman found him at dawn, already cold, his hand resting on the tool roll as though he had reached for it in the night. Tilda learned of it from Pater Stensland, who came to the cabin at mid-morning with his hat in his hands and said the words plainly because there was no gentle way to deliver them. She did not cry. Not then. She stood in the doorway and looked at the lean-to where Kittel had sat on the crate and shown her how pitch behaves in cold and how a stave speaks when it is true. She looked at the lake, where 5 ropes hung from posts he had helped her drive. She looked at the hatchet marks on the ice-hole rim, some of them hers and some of them his, indistinguishable now. She went to the livery that afternoon. The liveryman had covered Kittel with a blanket and left his tools untouched. Tilda picked up the canvas roll and unrolled it. The driving iron, the crows, the howl, the heading knives, the draw knife worn smooth at the handles. She held the driving iron and turned it in her hand. It was warm from the stove, and the handle was shaped to a grip that was not her grip, worn to the curve of Kittel's palm, smoothed by decades of use. She rolled the tools back into the canvas and carried them home. That evening, After the children slept, she went to the lean-to. She picked up a stave from the scrap pile, one of the pieces Kittle had salvaged from the dead barrel weeks ago, and she tapped it with the driving iron. The sound came back clean and clear, a ring that started at the iron and traveled through the wood and filled the small space of the lean-to with a note that meant the stave was true. She heard it the way he had taught her to hear it, not as vibration, as language. She set the stave down and pressed her hands against the workbench and stood there for a long time, listening to the silence where his voice had been. The community had changed, but the winter had not finished. The day after Kittle's burial, a shallow grave dug by 4 men with iron bars because the ground was frozen 3 feet deep, Peter Stensland arrived at Tilda's cabin with a barrel that had developed a slow leak at the bilge hoop. Water was seeping in. His carrots were sitting in an inch of brine-colored liquid. He needed the seam repitched, and the only person within 40 miles who could do it was standing in front of him. Tilda unrolled Kittle's tools on the workbench. She had not touched them since the night she tapped the stave. The driving iron felt different in her hand than it had when Kittle was alive, heavier, as though the weight of being the last person who knew how to use it had settled into the metal. She heated pitch. She examined the seam. The leak was at the junction of 2 staves where the bilge hoop had loosened a 1/4 inch, enough to break the pitch seal, but not enough to be visible from outside. She found it the way Kittle had taught her, by running a wet finger along the seam and watching for the spot where moisture disappeared into the gap instead of beating on the surface. She drove the hoop tighter. She repitched. She wrapped the seam in waxed linen. She did all of it with Peter watching, and when she finished, the barrel was tighter than it had been the day it was first sealed. Peter looked at the repair. He looked at the tools. "He taught you well," he said. "He taught me to hear the wood," Tilda said. The rest was practice. She meant it, but she also knew that Kittle had given her something no amount of practice could replace, the confidence to trust what she heard. A sound stave rang. A sprung stave thudded. The difference was the difference between food and hunger, between a barrel that held and a barrel that killed what it carried. Kittle had made her believe she could hear that difference. Now she had to believe it without him standing behind her, nodding. In early March, the cold relented for 3 days. The temperature climbed above freezing for the first time in weeks. Snow began to melt. Water ran in thin streams across the ice, pooling in low spots and seeping into pressure cracks. The ice that had been a platform, solid, reliable, a surface Tilda could walk on with loaded barrels, began to speak. It groaned. It cracked. It shifted in ways that made the ropes move and the anchor posts lean. Spring thaw in Dakota Territory does not arrive politely. It arrives in surges, warm days followed by freezing nights, melting and refreezing that weakens the ice structure from within. The surface looks solid while the interior becomes honeycomb, and a sheet of ice that supported a loaded sled one day can break under a child's weight the next. Tilda warned the families. She walked to every cabin that had barrels in the lake and told them the same thing. Retrieve your food now, while the ice still holds. Do not wait for the warmth to settle. The lake that kept your food safe in the cold will swallow it in the thaw. Most listened. Peter pulled his barrels on the first warm day. Karin retrieved her fish casks with help from a neighbor. The renters brought up their second barrel, the one that had been properly sealed after the first failure, and found their remaining potatoes intact. But one family did not move quickly enough. The Hovlands, a father, a mother, and 3 children who lived 2 miles east, had tied their single barrel to a willow post on a section of shore where the bank was undercut, and the ice extended over open water like a shelf. Tilda had warned them about this anchor point when they first sank the barrel. She had told them the willow was rotten and the ice shelf would be the first to go in a thaw. They had meant to move the anchor. They had not. On the third day of the warm spell, the ice shelf collapsed. It went with a sound like a door slamming, a single sharp crack followed by a grinding roar as a section of ice the size of a barn floor tilted and slid into the open water where the bank had undercut the edge. The Hovland barrel's rope snapped at the anchor post. The willow tore from the bank and went into the water with the ice. Tilda heard the sound from her cabin. She was already pulling on her coat when she saw the Hovland boy, 11 years old, fast on his feet, desperate to save the family's food, running across the remaining ice toward the break. She ran. The ice between the shore and the break was still intact but compromised. She could feel it flexing under her boots, a sickening give that meant the structure below was failing. The boy was ahead of her, 30 yards out, on his knees at the edge of the break, reaching into the water for the rope that was no longer attached to anything solid. "Stop!" Tilda shouted. "The ice will not hold you at the edge." The boy did not stop. He leaned farther. His weight pushed the ice edge down, and water slopped over the surface, soaking his knees and hands. Below him, the broken ice tilted and groaned. Tilda dropped to her stomach. She spread her weight across the ice and slid forward on her belly, the way Kittle had once told her to cross weak ice. Distributed weight, no standing, no sudden movements. She had never done it. He had described it during a conversation about lake fishing, a casual aside about retrieving nets in spring. She had filed it away the way she filed everything Kittle said, without knowing when it would matter. It mattered now. She reached the boy and grabbed his coat collar. He fought her. He twisted and reached for the water, where the rope end floated just beyond his fingertips, trailing from the sunken barrel somewhere below. "The barrel is gone," Tilda said. "The rope is not tied to anything. If you go in, you're gone too." She pulled him backward, sliding on the ice, both of them flat, the surface flexing and cracking around them in sounds that made her stomach clench. The boy was crying, not from cold or fear, but from the knowledge that the food was lost, and it was his family's fault for not moving the anchor when the widow had told them to. They reached solid ice, then solid ground. The boy sat in the snow and shook. Tilda sat beside him and did not let go of his coat until his breathing steadied. The Hovland barrel was gone. One family's winter stores, saved from the cellar freeze, only to be lost in the thaw. It was the sharpest possible reminder that the lake was not charity. It was a system, and systems failed when the rules were not followed. Tilda did not lecture the Hovlands. She gave them food from her own remaining stores, potatoes and apples, and a jar of plums, enough to bridge the gap until the thaw settled and supply trains could run again. She gave it without ceremony, the way Kittle had given his tools without ceremony, because the giving was not the point. The point was that the knowledge had worked, and where it had not worked, the failure was traceable to a specific, preventable cause. Bernd Halverson came to the site of the ice break that evening. He studied the shattered edge, the torn willow stump, the open water where the shelf had been. He looked at Tilda. "You told them to move the anchor," he said. "Yes." "They did not." "No." Bernd was quiet for a moment. "You saved the boy." "Kittle taught me how to cross weak ice," Tilda said. "I just had not done it before." Bernd looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not evaluation, not skepticism, not the measuring look of a man testing another person's competence. Something closer to recognition. The look of a man who understands that the person in front of him knows things he does not, and that the proper response is not judgment, but attention. "You should write this down," Bernd said. "All of it." The barrels, the pitch, the ropes, the anchor rules, the ice rules, before you forget, before the details go soft. I do not forget details, Tilda said. Everyone forgets details, Burnt said. Write them down. Bell's position in the community had shifted, not collapsed. Bell still owned the store, still controlled credit, still held the power that comes from being the person who decides whether a family eats on account or pays in cash. But the ground beneath that power had changed. Families that had feared Bell's pricing now had an alternative. Not for flour or nails or kerosene, those still came from his counter, but for the thing that mattered most in a winter that froze cellars and killed stores, the ability to keep food safe. That ability no longer required Bell's barrels or Bell's permission. It required knowledge, and the knowledge was free, and it came from the woman Bell had mocked in his own store. He had tried selling casks at inflated prices. He had tried discrediting Tilda's instructions. Both had failed. Now he tried something more direct. He told families that the spring thaw proved the lake method was temporary, that the food would have rotted if left another month, that the ice break proved the system was dangerous, that Tilda's teaching had nearly killed the Hovland boy. He said these things with the conviction of a man who had been wrong about something important and could not afford to admit it, because the admission would cost him more than money. It would cost him the illusion that he understood the world better than a widow with a hatchet and 5 barrels of rope. But the barrels that had been pulled before the thaw held food that families were eating. The jars were whole, the flour was dry, the pork was preserved, and the Hovland boy was alive because Tilda had crawled onto breaking ice to pull him back. Bell's words landed on ground that no longer supported them. People listened to him the way they listened to the wind. They heard it, they noted it, and they leaned into it without changing direction. The thaw settled in late March. The ice withdrew from the shore in stages. First the shallow edges, where dark water appeared between white shelves like gaps between teeth, then the middle sections, where pressure cracks widened into channels that steamed in the morning air. By the first week of April, Lake Thompson was open water again, gray and cold and restless under a sky that could not decide between rain and snow. The barrels that had been retrieved sat in lean-tos and cabins across the settlement. Most were empty now, their contents eaten through the last weeks of winter. A few still held food, the families that had stored more than they consumed, the ones whose cellars had partially held alongside the lake caches. The barrels themselves were stained and swollen from weeks of submersion, their staves darkened by lake water, their hoops rusted at the contact points. They looked like relics of something desperate and improvised, which is exactly what they were. But they had worked. 9 families had stored food in the lake. 7 had retrieved it successfully. 2 had lost partial stores. The Renner's first barrel and the Hovland's rope failure. No one had starved. No one had sold a claim under duress. No one had walked through a blizzard to beg food from a neighbor, except Torgrim Flatten, and Torgrim's cellar had not been supplemented with lake storage. The math was plain. The families who had listened to Tilda had food in February. The families who had not listened had frozen cellars and empty bins. Burnt Halvorsen, who understood supply logistics the way a carpenter understands load-bearing walls, put the calculation into words at a gathering in early April. He said that the winter of 1880 to 81 had destroyed an estimated 40% of cellar stores across the settlement. He said that Tilda Vangen's method had preserved approximately 70% of what went into the lake. He said these numbers without embellishment, in the flat tone of a man delivering a report, and the numbers did their own work. Amos Bell's store cellar failed on the 28th of March. It failed not from the deep cold that had passed, but from the freeze-thaw cycle that followed. Water seeped into the cellar through cracks the winter had opened in the foundation stones. It froze overnight, expanded, and opened the cracks wider. More water seeped in. more freezing, more expansion. By the time Bell discovered the damage, the back wall of his cellar had shifted 2 inches. The floor was glazed with ice, and the jars along the rear shelf had burst in a line, one after another, like dominoes falling in slow glass. Bell lost flour. He lost preserved goods that customers had paid to store in his cellar over winter, trusting his stone foundation and his cast iron stove to protect what their own cellars could not. He lost credibility, which for a storekeeper who traded on trust was worse than losing inventory. He came to Tilda's cabin on a Tuesday evening, after dark, when the road was empty and no one would see him walk the 2 miles from town to the lake. He knocked on the door, the real door, the one Burnt had helped Tilda hang in January to replace the horse blanket. He stood in the lamplight with his hat in his hands, and his face arranged into an expression that was not quite humility and not quite shame, but lived in the territory between them. "I need your help," Bell said. Tilda looked at him. She had not spoken to Bell since the day she traded Martin's watch for rope and barrels. She had heard his mockery secondhand through Pater, through Marit, through the quiet network of women who passed information between cabins like thread through a loom. She knew what he had said about her. She knew what he had tried to do to her reputation. She knew he had sold her the worst barrels in his stock and hoped they would fail. "Your cellar," she said. "The back wall shifted. The jars are gone. The flour along the east side is ruined. I have goods that belong to other families stored in the front section. Those are still intact. But if the wall shifts again—" "You need to move the goods before the next freeze," Tilda said. "I need to know where to move them." The silence between them held the weight of every joke Bell had made at his store counter, every dismissal, every offer to buy her food and claim at half price. Tilda could have turned him away. She had the right. The community would have understood. The man who had laughed loudest was now standing at the door of the woman he had laughed at, asking for the knowledge he had mocked. But the goods in Bell's cellar did not belong to Bell. They belonged to families who had trusted him. If those goods were lost because Tilda refused to help the man who held them, the families would suffer, not Bell. She put on her coat. They walked to the store in darkness. Tilda descended into Bell's cellar with a lantern and examined the back wall. The shift was visible, a gap where the stones had pulled away from the mortar, wide enough to see soil behind it. Water had pooled along the base and frozen into a ridge of dirty ice. The temperature in the cellar was hovering near freezing, held there by the stove above, but threatened by the breach in the wall. She told Bell what to do. Move everything away from the back wall immediately. Pack the breach with straw and clay to slow the water infiltration. Transfer the most vulnerable goods, jars, flour, anything that could not survive a freeze, to the front section nearest the stove. And for the goods that could not fit in the front section, she told him to bring them to the lake. "The lake is open," Bell said. "The ice is gone." "The lake is cold," Tilda said. "It will be cold for another month. You do not need ice to keep food above freezing. You need water that is colder than the cellar, but warmer than the freeze line. Suspend barrels from a dock frame or weighted float. The water near shore is warmer than your cellar right now." Bell looked at her. She could see him calculating, not the physics, which he did not fully understand, but the cost. The cost of admitting she was right. The cost of using her method publicly in front of the families whose goods he was supposed to protect. The cost of letting the widow from the lake become the person who saved his inventory. "I called it madness," Bell said. His voice was low, aimed at the cellar floor. "Because I could not sell it." Tilda did not respond to the confession. It was not her job to absolve Amos Bell. It was her job to keep food from freezing. "Bring the barrels to the dock frame tomorrow morning," she said. "I'll show you how to suspend them. Bring Bernd. He understands the rope system." She climbed out of the cellar and walked home in the dark, and she did not look back to see whether Belle was standing in his doorway watching her go. It did not matter. What mattered was that the food would survive, and the families who owned it would eat, and the method that Belle had laughed at in November was the method that saved his store in March. Bernd was there the next morning. So was Marit. So was Peter. They helped Belle move barrels to the lake shore and suspend them from a frame of pine logs that Peter built in 2 hours, driving stakes into the soft bank and lashing cross beams with the same rope Tilda had used all winter. Belle stood on the shore and watched other people save his goods with a technique he had publicly ridiculed for 4 months. He did not speak much. He carried barrels when told. He tied knots when shown. He did what Tilda instructed, and the families whose goods were at risk watched him do it, and the watching was its own kind of justice. Marit said nothing to Belle. She did not need to. Her presence, the practical skeptic who had once told Tilda that dry food belongs above ground, standing beside Tilda at the lake, helping suspend Belle's barrels, said everything that words would have cheapened. Bernd, who had been the first to measure, and the first to warn, and the first of the skeptics to admit error, spoke to Belle once. He said, "She told us in December. We did not listen until February. You are listening in March. That is late, but it is not too late." Belle took his goods. He paid Tilda nothing because Tilda had not asked to be paid. She had not helped Belle. She had helped the families whose food he held. The distinction was visible to everyone who watched, and it settled into the community's memory alongside the other facts of that winter, who had mocked, who had listened, who had survived, and how. Arne Moen arrived in De Smet in May, when the roads had dried enough for a wagon to travel without sinking to its axles. He was 35, a widowed schoolteacher from a settlement 60 miles east, and he had come because the Territorial Surveyor's Office had hired him to map lake depths and shoreline features for a land assessment. He carried a plumb line, a chain measure, a notebook, and the particular patience of a man who earns his living by writing down what he finds instead of what he wishes were there. He met Tilda at the lake. She was pulling the last of her winter barrels onto the shore, the dry goods cask, retrieved weeks earlier, but left to drain in the shallows. The barrel was stained dark and swollen, its hoops rusted, its pitch seams cracked from the thaw. It looked like something discarded. Arne, measuring the shoreline with his chain, stopped and watched a woman drag a barrel out of a lake with the competence of someone who had done it many times. "You store things in the water," he said. It was not a question. He had heard the story in town. "I stored things in the water all winter," Tilda said. "The water kept them." "How deep?" 25 to 30 feet, below the current where the temperature holds steady. Arne wrote this in his notebook. He wrote down the depth, the distance from shore, the type of anchor, the number of barrels. He asked questions the way a surveyor asks questions, not to judge but to record. He wanted measurements, not opinions. Tilda answered every question. She found herself explaining the method with a precision she had not used before, not the practical shorthand she gave to frightened families, but the full account, the water's density, her father's observation, the mill pond lesson, the pitch and wax seal system, the knot code, the ice edge management, the thaw retrieval protocol. Arne listened. He wrote. When she finished, he said, "This should be in a circular, something other settlements can read and adapt." "Bernd told me to write it down," Tilda said. Bernd was right. But a written record needs measurements, and measurements need someone who knows how to take them. I can map the lake, depths at intervals, temperature readings from different depths in different months, if I am here long enough. The method works, but for other people to trust it, they need numbers they did not have to discover themselves. It was the first conversation Tilda had with a man who respected the method before he respected her personally, and the distinction mattered. Kittel had recognized competence. Bernd had admitted error. Marit had overcome doubt. But Arne simply found the work interesting and wanted to document it properly, and that absence of emotional freight made the conversation easy in a way Tilda had not experienced in months. He came back the next day with depth measurements from 6 points across the lake. He came back the day after that with temperature readings taken by lowering a sealed thermometer in a weighted basket, a method Tilda recognized because she had done the same thing with Bernt's borrowed thermometer months earlier, in cruder form. Arna's measurements confirmed what Tilda had felt in her hands all winter. The lake bottom at 30 feet held steady near 38 to 40 degrees, above freezing, below the temperature that spoils food quickly. At 10 feet, the temperature dropped closer to 34 degrees, still safe but with less margin. At 5 feet near the ice interface during winter, the water could fall below freezing during extreme cold. The numbers drew a map of safety. Deeper was warmer, shallower was dangerous, and the zone between 15 and 30 feet was the space where food could survive. "Your father's lesson holds," Arne said, looking at his notebook. "The dense water settles. The cold water rises. The ice seals the surface, and the depth stays stable. It is elegant." "It is water," Tilda said. "It does not care about elegance." Arne smiled. It was the first time Tilda had seen him smile, and it changed his face from serious to something younger, and she noticed this and did not say anything about it. They worked together through May and June. Arne mapped the lake, not just the depth profile, but the shoreline contour, the current patterns, the bottom composition at each station. Sand and gravel near the east shore where anchors held best. Mud and silt on the south shore where stakes sank too easily. Rock ledge on the north point where rope could be tied directly to stone. The map became a guide. This shore for storage, that shore for retrieval, this depth for root crops, that depth for fragile jars. Together they produced a 4-page circular, handwritten, then copied by Arne's careful script that described the method in language a homesteader could follow. Which barrels, which seals, which depths, which foods, which ropes, which anchors, which warnings. The circular included a simple diagram of the rope and anchor system and a table of foods ranked by their tolerance to cold, damp storage. Potatoes and carrots first, they endured damp well and kept their structure in cold. Apples next, prone to softening at the outer layer but edible for months. Salted pork, essentially unchanged by cold water storage if the brine held. Jars, survivable if packed in straw and sealed against pressure. Flour and dry goods last, marked with a warning in heavy ink, separate cask, raised frame, double seal, retrieve first if any breach suspected, Tilda dictated. Arnie wrote. The work was collaborative in a way that felt like the best hours with Kittle, two people with different skills building something neither could build alone. The circular went to 3 settlements by midsummer, carried by mail riders and freight drivers. Tilda did not know how many people read it. She did not know how many tried the method, but the knowledge was no longer inside her cabin. It was on paper in Arnie's clean hand with measurements that someone else could verify. The courtship, if it could be called that, grew from the work. Arne returned to De Smet in September to complete his survey before winter. He brought additional instruments and a letter from the territorial office extending his commission. He also brought a crate of books for the settlement's informal school and a set of colored pencils for Ragna, who had drawn a picture of the lake on a flour sack during his first visit and given it to him without explanation. He did not court Tilda with gifts or declarations. He courted her by asking questions about barrel construction and listening to the answers. He courted her by teaching Eli how to use the chain measure and by letting Nels ride on his shoulders during the lake surveys. He courted her by being present without being necessary, by showing up with usefulness instead of need. One evening in October, after the children had gone to bed and the survey notes were spread across the table, Arne asked Tilda why she had not left after Martin died. He asked it the way he asked about lake depth, not to judge, but to understand. Because the claim was mortgaged, Tilda said. Because the ox team was gone. Because the rail line was unreliable. Those are the reasons you could not leave, Arna said. I asked why you did not. Tilda looked at the table, at the notes written in Arna's careful hand, at the measurements of the lake she had nearly drowned her family's food in. She thought about the question. It was not a question anyone had asked her before, because everyone had assumed the answer was obvious. She stayed because she had no choice. But Arna was a man who distinguished between what was measured and what was assumed, and he had noticed the gap. Because my father taught me that water behaves strangely near freezing, Tilda said, and I wanted to know if he was right. It was not the whole answer. The whole answer included Martin and the children, and the claim and the cellar and the horse blanket on the east wall, and every stubborn, practical, desperate reason she had for staying in a place that was trying to kill her. But it was the truest part of the answer, the part that explained not just why she stayed, but why she fought. She fought because her father had given her a piece of knowledge, and the knowledge was either true or it was not, and she needed to know. Arna looked at her across the table. The lamplight made his face serious and warm at the same time. He said, "Your father was right." "I know," Tilda said. "I checked." Tilda recognized what was happening between them. She recognized it because Kittle had shown her the same quality in a different form, the willingness to stand beside someone and work without asking what the work would earn. They married in the spring of 1882 in a ceremony at the church that Bernd Halvorsen attended without being asked, and Marit Solheim decorated with dried wildflowers she had pressed the previous summer. Arne moved into the cabin. He finished the east wall properly, framed, boarded, and sealed, and Tilda hung the horse blanket in the lean-to, where it served out its remaining years, keeping wind off the barrels. She kept the Vangen name on the claim. The land was in her children's names, and the children were Vangens, and the lake that had saved them was on Vangen ground. Arne understood this without it being explained. He added his name to the deed as a partner, not an owner. The distinction was legal and also personal, and Tilda appreciated both. The years that followed compressed the way years do when the crisis has passed, and the work becomes routine. Each autumn, Tilda inspected barrels. Each winter, she helped families prepare lake caches. Each spring, she supervised retrieval and recorded what had held and what had failed. The second autumn brought its own test. A family named Lindgren arrived from Wisconsin in September, a husband, wife, and 4 children, fresh on a claim 3 miles north with a shallow cellar and the wide-eyed confidence of people who had never spent a winter on open prairie. The husband, Torsten Lindgren, came to Tilda's cabin because Bernd had sent him, and he sat at her table with the expression of a man who was not yet afraid and did not yet understand why he should be. Tilda showed him the lake. She showed him the shore frames. She showed him a barrel from the previous winter, stained and swollen but intact, its pitch seams still visible along the base. She tapped the staves and let him hear the difference between sound wood and compromised wood. She made him practice the knot system with mittens on, the way Kittle had made her practice. "Why mittens?" Torsten asked. "My hands are not cold." "They will be," Tilda said. She gave him the same rules she had given everyone: deep water, tight casks, separate dry goods, double knots, check the ropes. She added one more, the rule she had learned from the Hovland failure: never tie to rotten wood and never trust an anchor you have not tested yourself. Torsten listened. He built his cache that autumn with Arna's help, and when the first hard frost came, his family had food in 2 places instead of 1. His cellar held through a moderate winter. The lake barrels were not needed, but the next winter was harder, and the cellar cracked along the east wall, and the barrels came up firm, and Torsten Lindgren became the person who taught the next new family what Tilda had taught him. That was how the knowledge moved, not through the circular alone, though the circular helped, through people teaching people, each one carrying the lessons forward with the specific authority of someone who had tested the method with their own food and their own children's hunger at stake. She improved the system steadily. Shore frames replaced willow posts, sturdier, deeper driven, resistant to thaw erosion. Double knots replaced single knots on anchor lines after a family lost a barrel to a slipped hitch. Willow markers gave way to painted stakes after the cloth strips rotted in the first spring rain. A retrieval schedule organized the families so they were not all chopping at the same ice hole on the same morning, weakening the surface faster than the cold could repair it. By the second hard winter, 3 improved cellars and 2 permanent lake cache systems served the settlement. Tilda did not replace root cellars. She taught redundancy. Food belongs in more than one kind of safety. A cellar that fails does not kill a family if the lake holds. A lake that shifts does not starve children if the cellar still stands. Bell never became kind. That was not his nature, and the winter had not changed it. What changed was his calculation. He stopped mocking the lake method because mockery cost him customers. He began stocking better barrels, tight cooperage instead of slack, because families now knew the difference and refused to pay for wood that would not hold. He kept his prices high, but the prices were for quality that matched the cost, and the families paid because the barrels worked. He never thanked Tilda. He never acknowledged publicly that she had saved his store inventory in March. But he stopped saying her name with laughter behind it, and in a small town where reputation travels by tone of voice, the absence of laughter was its own kind of admission. Bernd Halverson taught younger men to stop laughing before they had measured. He said this at the store, at the church, at every gathering where men decided who was wise and who was foolish. He said it with the authority of a man who had measured wrong once and did not intend to do so again. Marit Solheim became Tilda's strongest defender, which surprised no one more than Marit. She organized the women of the settlement into a shared preparation system, communal barrel inspections each autumn, coordinated food packing days, a lending library of tools that included kettles, driving iron, and crows, maintained by Tilda and available to anyone who asked. Eli grew into a carpenter. He built shore frames and barrel racks and, eventually, proper cellar cribbing with stone foundations, the kind of cribbing Bernd had said Tilda needed, and Martin had died before building. Ragna kept written household ledgers, food stores inventoried by weight and date, barrels tracked by condition and contents, retrieval dates logged with weather notes. The precision was hers. The impulse came from watching her mother count potatoes by lantern light in a lean-to while the wind tried to take the roof. Nels, the boy who had coughed through the worst of it, grew into a quiet young man who helped Arna survey ice thickness each winter. He walked the lake with a hand auger and a measuring stick, and wrote the numbers in a notebook that looked exactly like his stepfather's. He did not remember the winter that nearly killed him. He remembered the barrels. He remembered the ropes. He remembered his mother coming through the door with a potato in her hand and his brother crying at the table. Sang. In later years, Tilda did not talk much about the first winter. She talked about barrels. She talked about pitch and rope and the crow's depth that kept a lid seated. She talked about water and how it behaved near freezing, and why her father had made her feel the current under ice when she was 7 years old. She did not say the lake saved her family. She said the lake obeyed rules, and the rules could be learned, and hunger punished those who refused to learn them. She became a woman people consulted before frost entered the ground, not famous, not celebrated in the way that men who built bridges or broke horses were celebrated. Known in the way that a reliable well is known, always there, always producing, taken for granted by those who had never been thirsty. She kept Kittle's tools until the handles wore to her own grip. She never trained a cooper. She trained mothers, fathers, children, anyone who would listen to hear the difference between a sound stave and a dead one. The sound, she said, was the only thing that could not be faked. By the second winter after the hard winter, 12 families across 3 settlements had adapted the method. Some used it as a primary storage. Most used it as Tilda recommended, as a backup, a second line of defense against the cold that came every year and the catastrophic cold that came every decade. The circular Arnie had written traveled as far as western Minnesota, carried by a freight driver who recognized the lake diagram and asked for extra copies to distribute along his route. The method did not replace root cellars. It was never meant to. It supplemented them. It filled the gap that opened when the ground froze deeper than anyone expected, when the winter lasted longer than anyone planned, when the margin between enough and not enough narrowed to a few degrees and a few feet of frozen earth. Tilda lived out her life near Lake Thompson. The cabin grew over the years. Arna added a second room, then a porch, then a proper root cellar with 8 feet of depth and stone cribbing and a drainage channel that Eli designed at 14. The lake sat 300 yards away, unchanged, dark water over deep cold, holding whatever was given to it the way water always holds things, patiently, silently, according to rules that do not care whether anyone understands them. She died in 1912 in a bed Arnie had built from lake country oak, in the room with the east wall she had once covered with a horse blanket. Her grandchildren were in the next room. Kittle's tools were in the lean-to, rolled in canvas that had been replaced twice, but still carried the shape of the original roll. The men at Bell's stove had called it madness. They had said she was feeding the lake before she fed her children. They had laughed in the particular way that people laugh when they are certain someone else's idea will fail, and the certainty had been reasonable, and the certainty had been wrong. On a February morning in 1881, Tilda Vangen had chopped through 10 inches of ice, lowered a rope into black water, and pulled up a potato that was not frozen. Eli had touched it and cried. Ragna had held it against her cheek. Nels had reached for it and said a word that might have been eat. The lake had held. The pitch had held. The rope had held. And Tilda Vangen had put her family's food where winter could not reach it, because her father had shown her when she was 7 years old that the coldest place is not always at the bottom.